One can all are no summer there and mine, all can and some going there mine, all can and some going there mine there. Can be cause I was the boy raised in the dawn, but some there mine, all can and some going there mine there. Can. I was interested in the possibility of poetry as a language of power, but with a kind of, regret, that it doesn't exist in that way. It's not power as rhetoric. It's, it implied a different kind of power that, that language could somehow force a response from things and. To say the word was to, somehow control the object. Now, I don't think that's really the case, but that poetry should be derived, from that kind of magical language. Gives me something, to think about. I mean, I see myself as, coming out of a line of language users, language shapers, going back, in one direction or another to proto-poets, shamans, or whatever, who use language in that way. And I don't want to lose track of that. I wanted to explore it, more and more. No, as a poet, I almost never lose track of sound. Or the sound of words. Like other poets of this time, I have, given up any reliance on terminal rhyming, rhymes that fall neatly at the ends of lines. But within the writing, I'm aware of words that suggest other words by their sound. Even as with the gematria that I was talking about, words might suggest other words by their numerical value. So it's a way of moving around in the poem. That rhyme can encourage surprises in poetry. Against simply the straightforward pattern of rational, logical thinking. Instead to follow sounds through the poem, and by the sounds suggesting words, you find yourself moving in unexpected directions. And I wanted to move in an unexpected direction, so that was one way of doing it. I think one of the pleasures of what began to happen for us again, in the 1950s, and that maybe we've lost some track of, since then, was this bringing poetry, back to a sense, not of seriousness is not the word I mean, but it was bringing the heroic back into poetry, and there's a lot of discomfort in saying that, and one doesn't get away with it very easily. But among us, why not say it? There's and I've never used the word heroic for it before, but there is a kind of heroic quality there, and even though it's hard to hold on to, I think the idea of the poet under those circumstances is important, and language is important. It's all important. It's all important.
Jerome Rothenberg.
The mystery of evil rests in God, no less in terror.
Fathers who shun the world cry scandal where they spawn, eyes dark as dungeons, a wool beard on every face. Men grow transparent in their rages, oblivious the more they claw with longing at each other's flesh. The mystery of terror rests in God, no less in evil. Poems are written to the dead, the ones who do not speak nor share a common language. In the air of caves, a figure like a god lies broken. His glasses tumble to the ground, his breath smells sweet to everybody. Fools find places where they track the stalkers, legs that cross a line that dwindles to a point that shatters. Stars collide, the words of poems go up in smoke. Mothers brandish babes like weapons. There is no boundary dividing life from art.
I got out of high school early. I think I was about 16 and a half. I went from high school into City College, which was then the free university. And, some things some of the visitors I remember in particular, because this happens now also at universities when a poet comes to visit. Students would have lunch with the distinguished visitor. So what I'm remembering in particular is a visit from William Carlos Williams, great American poet, who was himself in part from an immigrant family, mother from Puerto Rico, so that's the Carlos in the William Carlos Williams, and realizing that he was where he was, talking at City College, began to encourage us, as the children of immigrants, to take over, to take over the language. You can do whatever you want to, with he's talking about English, whatever you want with this language, and the closed forms that were dominating in the poetry, which we thought, was so important. The phrase was, smash it to hell, you have a right to it. Smash it to hell, you have a right to it.
Jerry and I got married in 1952 when he was in Michigan doing a master's and I was finishing my bachelor's at Queens. Well, we got back from Michigan and we together got jobs at the Otis Elevator Company. Oh, I was in the typing pool and Jerry was a mail clerk. And he'd come in mailing pushing the mail cart, and all the ladies in the typing pool would be very, giggly and so on, because, well, whatever, that didn't last long. Jerry is an extremely dedicated poet. I think he always has been. He started writing poetry in his teens. He's a serious person, but he takes, his relationship to poetry very seriously, and his relationship to the world of poetry very seriously. So part of what Jerry does, of course, is work all the time. He's always got projects going. He's not just writing poems. That he couldn't sustain, but he is interested in doing other things anyway. This sense of contribution, I think, is a very strong one for him.
The Cold War obviously changed things in America, and one had to, maneuver in relation to that to maintain some kind of integrity, and we learned, I think, much to our advantage, to find ways of creating a culture, helping to create a culture of resistance, which was part of the experience for us of the 1950s, and then came into a different phase in the 1960s. By 68, my own work had taken a certain shape that I hadn't anticipated. The poetry had constantly been changing from a kind of radical adolescence in relation to poetry, with a fascination for a poetry that broke down old forms and created new forms. A discouragement of that during the years that I was at the university, at the time of things in American literary terms like the new criticism. It was a conservatizing time, both politically and and literarily, and then reacting against that and emerging with other poets into the 1960s during the time that came to be characterized by so-called Beat Generation. The Beat Generation was was a signal. It was a signal that for us, that the radical, the experimental, the re-spiritualizing, all of those things were now possible. Again, I mean, it was part of us, but we didn't quite know where in the world to place it, or how we could, proceed with that, Alan and Howl, as as the first great poem to come out of that. It signaled that everything was possible again. If Howl was possible, then everything that had been pushed aside by the new critics and the conservative poem makers of that time, everything that had been pushed aside, could come out again, and we could take a new beginning. And we did, So I mean, that's why, for people like me, that time in the middle 1950s was really an exciting. It was not accepted. It seemed dangerous. It seemed to put us into jeopardy. The academic poets in the 1950s had gone back to writing in closed forms, strict meters, rhyming poetry, and the line of Whitman or William Carlos Williams, or the experiments of the surrealists were coming into the other work. Concrete poetry was being written in various parts of the world. Performance was opening up as a possibility, and suddenly, all of these things were there to be done, and there didn't seem to be anything in the way of doing it. Particularly because we also learned ways of circulating, of distributing, of making the work public, either through our own presses and and magazines. But what happened in the middle 50s is maybe initiated in San Francisco, where poets were doing crazy things like that. A new kind of poetry reading began, which was really under the control of poets, and could happen anywhere that a space was available, and could be turned into a public space. And then this came into New York as well, and here, there were poetry readings, and if we weren't invited to read poetry, we could find a place and set up our own readings, and so it seemed to me at a certain point nobody was reading poetry publicly, and a few years later everybody was reading poetry publicly, and once you were into the reading, at least for some of us, you were also into performance.
Where MacLo walks, someone stops the clock. The hands are set at 23. In the rush of air beneath his table, the toes are beating out a symphony. A man is sitting on a chair inside a classroom with black windows. The sun is cold against the man's cheek. Fingers on a keyboard send a message to the king of thumbs. The message to MacLo is further coded, aiming to reciprocate, I offer a black sun. The sense of night rests in my mind, a pall of thought above the silent river, see it running through a false partition in the heart. I want to wear a top hat and to dance with what's her name. A bunch of keys is what I give you. In the black night, no one sleeps as light as you, oh camarado. Dreaming of it, reaching through the gauze, the entry to the sable night is such an opening. It finds the dark-eyed night alive and counts the moon a stranger. No one will leave my table, but we will sit around until the mother comes with lesser portions. Kurt Schwitters can arrive at midnight, seated in the central row, a shade beneath our nightlight. Wrapped in a cowl, the night is hanging, moaning. It is called a cowled night, not a night the pointer nudges, but a phantom presence in the hush of night. Is it then Europe's night that hides him, England's night raids that create a noonday night? A long electric night, a gala night that turns into an empty night, an unseen night, a night to feel and touch. Is it a night that breaks the glamour of a lost midsummer's night, a night that ends in death? The voice of Schwitters calls me in the darkness, rising like a cry of witness through the great primeval night. Dark wheels and axles, dark dentist drills, dark locomotives, a ticking clock, a meat grinder, barbed wire fences, dark shoes and wigs and ice skates, dark squads of people on a stage lit by a darkness visible as light. A night of shining darkness, of darkness giving birth, plump swollen creatures in the night, a night of darkened turtles being born, of horn-billed turtles pregnant with small lobsters, sharp-nosed creatures, fat ones swollen in the night, where time stands still for us inside the poem, and only there the poem becomes a night poem and gives back the night. A flower like a raven, Schwitters cries. He names a night bird. In love with incandescence, Schwitters finds a clock and sets it right. He and McClough are changing places, swallowing a dog, a cat, a rooster. Both are now waking up. The clockwork world is pressing on their pupils. An old alarm clock's hanging from a scarecrow's neck. It spells out love gone mad. A night of mystifying flowers. Night of surprises. Kurt and Jackson, two old hoofers, dancing. The world applauds their act. A nightclub swoons. Caught in a ring of dancers, they trade pronouns as the night runs on. Night rhymes with womb and slaughter. Music as sure as light and bright. A night train rumbles into Oslo. Kurt rhymes with Jackson. Poem rhymes with face and light. A line of poets rhymes along the lines of sight. I walk into a hall beside my father where the walls sing silent night. Kurt tells the story of his Norwegian flight. We raise ourselves by inches as if we were learning to recite. To constrain is thrilling, to explain is erudite. We barter words with Kurt and Jackson in a garden of delight. Here begins another night poem, uniting light and night.
On one occasion, Sorel had arranged for us to do a series of readings in Brooklyn at 3 different libraries. And then the third was in Flatbush, it was a Jewish audience. Now the poems, some of them are rather nasty poems. One line says, who would write the double yod, the double yod upon my cock. And at the end, one guy came up and, I think probably from the Jewish Defense League or something, and threatened to kill me. But I was also watching and participating in singing performances at the Seneca Reservation.
We went up to the Allegheny Seneca Reservation and lived there for 2 years. And that was a very, very nice experience. When we went there the first time, in '67, I think Jerry probably explained to you why we went. It's because a friend who was an anthropologist who had been with that group for a few months. I mean, he hadn't been there for a very long time. But he said to Jerry, who was finishing Technicians of the Sacred, you really ought to go and into the field. You ought to go meet some people, work with them, whatever. So he gave us a letter of introduction. We were there with Matthew, who was a year and a half. So in the evening, I would stay in the motel with Matthew when Jerry went off to, the singing society and, whatever activities, ceremonies, festivals, picnics, weddings, whatever went on. we were very much part of that world and were always included. Jerry spent the summer working with some of the singers on translating texts. We were absolutely participants in the community, but we were not Indians. And although we were part of the clan structure, and people took that seriously. I mean, we have our names, and those are clan names. They're not just made-up names, they're clan names. The idea is that only one person is supposed to have a name at a time. So when we die, we're supposed to give the name back. I don't know how we're ever going to tell them, that we are dead and they can take the name. But, and some of these names go down in history. Jerry's name, for instance, is a name that keeps coming up, a name that often got given to white people who wasn't George Washington, but it was somebody like that, who had the same name that Jerry has.
So I was learning things about performance in that way, and performance is an element that comes into, or the recording of a performance comes into the anthologies also, and putting a big emphasis in terms of orality and in terms of performance for the kind of material that's being assembled in Technicians of the Sacred and Shaking the Pumpkin. Shaking the Pumpkin, name taken from a Seneca Indian ceremony. So for a number of years, I've got a concentration on the oral and the performative, which makes people think that I'm pushing the written word aside. But I want all of it. I want all of it.
The whole development of the concept of ethnopoetics, which was his, has been extremely influential, and he's always been very eager to, disseminate the idea, to share, to bring other people in, and that's always an aspect of what Jerry does, is that he's very social, and he's very generous in relation to the poetry world. In a way, this is, let's say, where I come in, because we've always been very open and very social. And, I make dinners a lot. I used to make a lot more dinners. But our house was always the meeting place. And, people were always invited up. And people were brought together. We always liked to introduce people to each other, He was in contact with Charles Bernstein when Charles was just starting, and Charles's interests seemed to correspond to Ron Silliman's interests. And so it was Jerry who brought them together, and then they started the magazine Language. But he's always done that, brought people together, because the anthologies are, in a way, the same kind of thing. I mean, he brings a lot together, and I think he's a very generous spirit and a very driven spirit. I mean, that is to say, he resents wasting a moment because there's always something, that he's waiting to do and that he has to get to. And I think he gets positively nervous if he doesn't have a project. So
I began working at the Seneca Indian Reservation on a big Jewish book. So that seemed like the perfect thing to be doing there. And completing a series of poems called Poland 1931, my attempt to call into question and to get involved in a type of identity writing about which I had many qualms before I got into it. to explore ancestral sources of my own in a world of Jewish mystics, thieves, and madmen. Poland, 1931, The Wedding. My mind is stuffed with tablecloths and with rings, but my mind is dreaming of Poland, stuffed with Poland, brought in the imagination to a black wedding, a naked bridegroom hovering above his naked bride. Mad Poland, how terrible thy Jews at weddings, thy synagogues with camphor smells and almonds, thy thermos bottles, thy electric fogs, thy braided armpits, thy underwear alive with roots, O Poland. Poland, 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 how thy bells wrapped in their flowers toll, how they do offer up their tongues to kiss the moon, old mother stuck in thy sky, thyself, an old bell with no tongue, a lost udder. O Poland, thy beer is ever made of rotting bread, thy silks are linens merely, thy tradesmen dance at weddings where fanatic grooms still dream of bridesmaids, still are screaming past their red mustaches, Poland. We have lain awake in thy soft arms forever. Thy feathers have been balm to us. Thy pillows capture us like sickly wounds and guard us. Let us sail through thy fierce weddings, Poland. Let us tread thy markets where thy sausages grow ripe and full. Let us bite thy peppercorns. Let thy oxen's dung be sugar to thy dying Jews. O Poland, O sweet, resourceful, restless Poland. O Poland of the saints, unbuttoned Poland, repeating endlessly the triple names of Mary. Poland, 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 Poland. Have we not tired of thee, Poland? No, for thy cheeses shall never tire us, nor the honey of thy goats. Thy grooms shall work ferociously upon their looming brides, shall bring forth executioners, shall stand like kings inside thy doorways, shall throw their arms around thy lintels, Poland, and begin to crow. And then somebody translated that for me into Yiddish. Poland 1931, The Wedding, became Poland 1931, the Chasene. Mein Miach ist ungestoppt mit Tischdacher und mit Fingerlach, aber mein Miach Holland von Polen, angestoppt mit Polen, in Dimmien gebracht zu a schwarzer Chassene, a nacketer Chossen schwebt über sein nacketer Kalle, mit tieriftige Polen, wie schrecklich deine Jiden auf Chassenes, deine Schulen mit Kampfern, Reiches und Mandeln, deine Thermosen, deine elektrische Tumanen, dein Unterwäsch lebendig mit Wurzeln, oi Polen, 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 Polen. Once did a performance of that while we were in Milwaukee at a let's say a retirement home or a nursing. It was for an older Jewish audience. So I did the poem in English, and then I did the poem in the Yiddish translation. And one of the women, discussion that followed, she said, that was a very nice poem. She said, but I tell you, the Yiddish original is much better than the English translation. There was very consciously a sense that within the United States there had also been a genocide. At the end of Poland, 1931, the figure that I invoke there is a California Indian named Ishi, who was the last survivor of his group, a small tribe or band or nation of Indians who had been deliberately exterminated by white settlers. And there's a photograph of him when he first comes out of the wilderness, I guess, basically naked, and they throw a trench coat, around him. He's a very thin, gaunt figure with his coat thrown around him. It's like those people coming out of the death camps. The figure at the end of Poland, 1931, is the American Indian Ishi, with it seemed to me, a sense, the strange linguistic coincidence. He never gave his real, his name. He just gave the Yana Indian word for a person, for a man, Ishi. And I thought, well, gee, in Hebrew, Ish, also is a man.
So a series of poems called the Lorca Variations, Variation Lorca, and here I was using vocabulary from English translations that I had made of Lorca from a series of his poems called suites, in the musical sense, suites. So many of the words are Lorca's, the poems are mine, or shared between us. And it begins with this. Lorca's Spain, a homage. Beginning with olive trees, shadows. Beginning with roosters, crystal. Beginning with castanets and almonds, fishes. This is a homage to Spain. This mists dogs. This silences rubber. This is Saturn. Beginning with yellow, eclipse. Beginning with needles, insomnia. Beginning with baskets, the moon. Who is naked? The imagination, wrote Lorca, is seared. This is a homage to water, beginning and end.
The translating at various times I've thought of as in a way central to my work as a poet, and I think maybe I've tended to exaggerate that. I began, because it sounded good to say so, began to think that maybe all poetry and all communication involves translation at some level. So that even when we're speaking the same language, we're translating each other. In conversation, we can stop and say, what do you mean? Meaning, help me, translate what you're saying to me. Put this in other words. Paraphrase it. Paraphrase as a form of translation. One of the recent books called "Writing Through," subtitled "Translations and Variations." And the variations go, all the way to those poems that I was speaking about, right? First translate Lorca, and then take Lorca's vocabulary, and through a procedure, create new poems out of that. And I would say that's an extension of translation. The term "writing through" comes from John Cage, who did was a poet as well as a composer, and did a series of works called "Writing Through Finnegan's Wake," writing through Ezra Pound's cantos, meaning going all the way through, using a procedure, and coming out with a series of new writings, derived entirely from the other writings, not translation as such, but certainly in some relation, to translation. Or another term that I would use for it was othering. It was a process of othering, meaning using the work or the language of some other, or turning it into something else. I came across a poem of Gertrude Stein's, or it's part of a poem, otherwise it was vocabulary typically Stein, domestic terms, uncharged terms, non-romantic writing, and quite abstract. But one little section read, pass over, pass over, pass over, pass, 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 pass. So I said, pass over. Gertrude Stein is writing a Jewish poem. So I thought that's, so I did a variation on a poem by Gertrude Stein, which read, pass over, pass over, pass over, pass, 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 pass water. I said, well, I've done a variation on a poem. Then I took this whole poem, broken into 13 parts, and I was been reading the fiction writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, and liking that very much. And I said, well, what would happen if I took the Gertrude Stein poem, and took vocabulary that kind of rhymed with the Stein poem and substituted Singer's vocabulary for Stein's. And I don't have that right in front of me to. I can't remember what the Stein was, but I did that and wrote a poem called Satan and Gore, a homage to Isaac Bashevis Singer. The first line, 13 little pieces, goes, sect, avert, to wash bellies, sect, avert, sect. I forget what the Stein was. I think it's fish, bequeath fish. And sect, avert, sect. The translations of Lorca that I had done, which I expected to be published immediately as a separate book of poems, instead, because of the trade publisher that had commissioned them, became part of a large collected translations of Lorca. So I went back to the Lorca poems that I had translated and used his vocabulary and set up a process where I could use his vocabulary and write new poems out of that.
Every wise man considers himself another Newton. A philosopher musing beside trees and water, going for a walk or coming from a walk, pulling genies out of waves and sky, with which sigh makes a perfect rhyme. Their corneas are focused on infinity and disregard the lonely cricket just as Newton did. And just as Newton knew the wind, or Wordsworth knew a certain word to be the night's reflection, so apples floating on a wave of crickets make a synthesis more powerful than stars. Philosophers should play guitars, then, reaching for those apple branches where the moon's a lowly apple, pyramids adorned with owls express a kind of harmony, and stars are dots and are a proof of death more powerful than worms. What if the river makes a pose? The cedar will show a face that brings it home.
I think that Jerry has had a profound influence on the world of contemporary poetry. Whether the poetry itself has had a profound influence is neither here nor there. I mean, clearly it has on some and it hasn't on others, I mean, Jerry is dedicated to an experimental mode and, has never been interested in a way in adjusting himself to a larger poetry audience.
One can, all are now, some there and mine, all can and some going, there are mine, all can and some going, there are mine, there, can, all are now summer there, and mine all gone and some going there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone because I was a boy raised in the dawn, and but some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone and in the swollen house his breath has blown, and some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone with those spirit horses that are blue, and when bosom there, mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone with those spirit horses that are blues down now. Some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone with jewels of every kind to be there, but some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone with Hogan horses of every kind to be there, but some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone with men of every kind to be there, but some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone and everything that's there before, and we walk upon, and some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone and everything that's more and won't be poor, no winged gone, but some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone my horses that are living to be old and pleasant, and some there are mine, all gone and some going there, mine there. Gone because I am the boy whom blessed to be, and through some there, mine, all gone and some going there, mine there.
Yo vena yo, haine yo na yo vena yo gayana waya hea yo vena yo haine yo na yo vea yo gayana waya hea